Hello, everybody. Author T. Blake Brady here, and I've been thinking about The Exorcist Believer. Now, everybody has had their turn whacking at this movie like a pinata, but I'm not going to talk about whether or not the movie was good. The thing that I want to talk about is maybe why it's bad and why it doesn't resonate with audiences.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
Now, first and foremost, I think that The Exorcist Believer suffers from the fact that it is being compared to one of the most resonant horror movies of all time. One movie that even 50 years later, people still watch with a sense of tension and apprehension. When The Exorcist flooded onto screens in 1973, people were passing out in the aisles. People were talking about the movie outside. They were standing in lines. It was kind of a blockbuster before Jaws.
Do you remember what particular scene it was
When she was in, what was it? When she was in a room, the doctors came in, and I guess it was when she was talking the devil's voice. Oh God, I can't believe it.
And so, if you're going to name a movie The Exorcist, then there is going to be a sense of a shadow hanging over that film. And the fact that this one is a legacy sequel, then it has a lot more to uphold for it to be considered good. And what's our word for today? Resonant. Now, the first 30 minutes accomplishes what it needs to, and that is to make us feel empathy for the father, played by Leslie Odom Jr., and the daughter, Angela.
I wanted to talk to Mom.
Some would argue that we need to get to the possession thing as soon as possible, but I would argue that The Exorcist doesn't necessarily get to it as quickly either. It kind of builds up because the movie is not necessarily about a possession. The movie is about something bigger, and that's the thing that makes The Exorcist Believer suffer. It's not about anything bigger. It is about this plot, and it is really trying to trace over the edges of the original film, and that is where it fails miserably. Kurt Vonnegut talks about making a character empathetic so that you will care what happens to them later. And that is not what happens in The Exorcist Believer. The relationship between the father, Leslie Odom Jr.'s character, and Angela basically disappears once the daughter returns. I mean, we all know that inherently, but that is the problem, is that the movie takes this aspect of a relationship for granted. We get a sense of what Leslie Odom Jr. is feeling throughout the movie when his daughter Angela disappears, but we don't get it later in the film. It doesn't redouble or reconnect with the idea of what his life will be like without her. He has already experienced a traumatic loss in the form of losing his wife. And that is another element that is meant to make us sympathetic toward him, and it does. But what happens is we do not have that carried forward in the film. We have a bunch of plot, and plot can be anathema to a story. Plot is the things that need to happen in a story to move it forward, and The Exorcist Believer gets way too caught up in plot and does not care about story. The story here is between a father and his daughter, and you can even add Catherine's story in there as well. It just becomes kind of a boo haunted house, oogie boogie scenario about halfway through, and I think that's where we lose the tension and the momentum of the first 30 minutes of the film. We have to talk about the ending, and I'm not going to spoil specifically what happens, so there is no spoiler here, but spoiler, there's an exorcism. It's The Exorcist. It just doesn't have the visual audacity that the original does. And it sounds like I'm contradicting my point here, but the exorcism part of a story doesn't really need to have a story vision so much as it needs to have a cinematic vision. And there is no cinematic vision for the last 30 minutes of the movie. Now, in the original, we have characters who are experiencing loss of faith. And faith barely plays a part in this movie. We are living in a time period where faith doesn't play as big a role in people's lives, and that's not a judgment one way or the other, but what it does is it makes kind of the stakes of the spiritual aspect of this film moot. One of the things that the original does so well is that Father Karras, who is ostensibly our hero, I guess, he is losing his faith because of what's happening to his own mother. He is someone who feels lost and adrift in the world. And we don't get an analog for that in this movie. We get a lot of characters who try to fill that space, but no one specifically does. And we don't have a stand-in for the loss of faith. Leslie Odom Jr.'s character has no faith to begin with. He has to gain faith, and that is also something that doesn't really happen. Catherine's family has faith, but theirs turns them into lunatics, which kind of speaks to the middle third of the Halloween trilogy directed by David Gordon Green. But what we don't get is a sense of perspective about the world that we live in. That is crucial to us caring about the outcome of the exorcism. The movie needed to end, so we had events take us to that ending, and that's where we're left. The Exorcist Believer is ultimately unsuccessful because it mistakes plot for story. If you like this video, subscribe below to get more analyses of films from the perspective of an author like myself. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time. Bye!